The Jewish Channel's Week in Review. What's going unsaid in discussion of the war in Gaza, Bagels Nouveau, reviving the work of a major philosopher, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. In the fog of war, a great many facts and claims are shared with great speed, but little precision. Whether individual citizens doing the sharing these days with social media tools assisting them has made that situation better or worse is anyone's guess. But accurate information is hard to come by, and in many cases, information will be disputed for years to come. Amidst all of the information overload of Israel's 2014 war with Hamas, however, there is one thing that is going explicitly unsaid. There is a piece of information that is quite willfully held from the public. Pay attention to these clips.
Because no military in history has taken greater care than the IDF to protect innocents of the other side.
No other army in the world has ever done more than Israel is doing now to save the lives of innocent civilians.
There's been no army in the history of warfare that has done more than Israel to avoid and minimize civilian casualties.
And no one should accept criticism of Israel for acting with restraint that has not been shown and would not be shown by any nation on earth.
You'll notice that all those statements simply use phrasings like no other army. What they don't do is ever specify that other army that could be compared with Israel. But of course, there's only one other military in the world that has been regularly engaged in wars and battles and covert operations to fight what it defines as terrorist acts, and that is the United States military. There are probably any number of diplomatic experts who could articulate quite clearly why Israeli officials won't make a direct comparison of Israel's conduct with that of the United States, and they'd more or less come down to the claim that shaming America is hardly in Israel's broader interests. But what would a comparison like that yield? Well, for starters, there's the question of tactics used to avoid civilian deaths. Israel has made much of the claim that it warned civilians that an attack is coming through launching a small explosive on the roof of a targeted building, a practice called roof knocking, with residents given some seconds to attempt to flee. Israel has also at times made phone calls and dropped leaflets to let local citizens know they're being targeted. Critics note that Israel doesn't always do any or all of these things, and many civilian deaths have come without any warning at all. Critics further assert that these kinds of attacks in dense urban areas leave local residents without anywhere safe to flee to, rendering many of these warnings useless. So how does the U.S. military and covert operations arm conduct itself when it is targeting locations it considers to host terrorist personnel or weaponry? Multiple studies of U.S. drone strikes have reached an estimate of more than 2,000 people killed since 2004 in Pakistan alone, with civilian casualty counts of more than 200. Under President Barack Obama, in the single year of 2011, several studies claim more than 300 were killed in Pakistan by U.S. drone strikes, and at least dozens of civilians were killed. All those numbers are for Pakistan alone. In Yemen, Human Rights Watch investigated 6 airstrikes that have occurred under the administration of President Barack Obama and found that they killed a total of 82 people, 57 of whom were civilians, including at least one pregnant woman and at least 3 children. Somewhat famously, this past December, a wedding in Yemen was attacked, with Human Rights Watch reporting it is probable that 12 civilian deaths resulted. For all of the hundreds of U.S. airstrikes in Pakistan and Yemen in these years, the U.S. military did not roof knock, drop leaflets, or make phone calls. Indeed, there is not a single reported instance of the U.S. warning a given area that an airstrike is coming and that civilians should seek shelter. Many U.S. drone strikes take place outside of urban areas, and so the U.S. civilian casualty count there is actually a fair amount lower than it is for other U.S. military activities. In the 10 years that the United States maintained a war in Afghanistan, however, a variety of military confrontations more analogous to the current war in Gaza took place. Taking into account a variety of sources reporting on the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the U.S. and NATO civilian casualty count seems likely to be at least 4,000, if not quite a lot higher. And so, when Israeli officials are describing some vague other army that wouldn't use the same methods of warning and efforts to reduce civilian deaths Israel does, it's quite clear that Israel is restraining itself from pointing the finger directly at the United States military. Moving on, a key element in Jewish cuisine is undeniably the bagel. But everything begs for reinvention, and Meredith Gansman has a look at some ways that's being undertaken.
In the middle of Little Italy, there are any number of cheese stores, gelato shops, and Italian restaurants, but gourmet bagels, they're less typical to find, except at Baz Bagel.
Today we're making our Baz signature sandwich. This is our pumpernickel everything bagel.
Barry Masaccio, who's half Jewish and half Italian, opened Baz Bagels this spring in Manhattan's Little Italy, right near the historically Jewish Lower East Side.
There's just something about bagels that really hits the spot for me. One part of it's just like a memory of like going to the bagel store with my parents and eating that, 3 times a week for breakfast.
Masaccio is one of several young chefs reclaiming their roots with new takes on the classic bagel shop. Noah Bermanoff brought his native Montreal bagels to New York City at Black Seed Bagel. Montreal bagels are boiled in honey. The dough is baked with egg in a wood-burning oven. But there's no egg in Black Seed's bagels, making them more of a hybrid between the two cities.
A bagel's meant to be a distinctive bread product that speaks to our tradition, and I feel like it's really departed from that at the average bagel store.
Talk about a departure. Bar Bolinat owner and chef Inan Admoni is serving a bagel from the other side of the world. What's the difference between a Jerusalem bagel and the typical New York bagel that we have here?
The dishes come from Jerusalem.
Well, that would be a good start, yes. By now, 3 types of bagels in, I'm sure you're getting hungry. So let's roll some out. At Baz Bagels, Masaccio is not trying to reinvent the wheel. She's boiling and baking the old-fashioned way.
The bagels are hand rolled every evening, and then they rest overnight, and then they are boiled in a kettle, baked on burlap boards, and then put into a rotating oven. Those are the way that they were made in New York for 100 years. And then in one quick motion, flip the bagels off.
All right, I'm gonna see if I can do it too. Ready? Glove on. Shake it. One quick motion. All right, kind of, almost. Bermanoff makes a Tobiko caviar cream cheese and lox sandwich at Black Seed Bagel.
We just thought a combination of 2 great things could make a 3rd thing that's perhaps even better than that.
And at Bar Bolinat, the bagel is going from breakfast to bar food.
Cheers.
Dip it in oil and spices and enjoy. For these bagel artisans, the most important ingredient in bagel making is nostalgia.
What are the ingredients that made this product so good? What are the techniques that made it so good? And now just making them that way.
If we don't step up now, we will lose these cultural artifacts forever.
To see more from these new bagel offerings, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, examining justice in our laws with an editor of the New York Times op-ed section and one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century. The summer of 2014 is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, a piece of legislation that changed America overnight and introduced freedoms and opportunities for African Americans that so many of us take for granted. But the sausage-making process of that legislation and the focus on law as a source of injustice reveal aspects of our legal system that often go unmentioned. New York Times op-ed section editor Clay Risen re-reports on the Act's passage in the book The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act. One of the great works of one of the great philosophers of the 20th century was almost completely lost to history. In Michel Foucault's waning years, he delivered a series of lectures on truth and the criminal justice system and never had the time to develop his thoughts into a published book. But recovering those lectures and publishing them in context is Bernard Harcourt, co-editor of the volume Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, The Function of Avowal in Justice. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Bernard Harcourt. Who was Foucault? And what was the larger impact of his work?
His most well-known contribution is called Discipline and Punish, which was published in 1975, so 6 years before these lectures. And that book, which kind of represented the way he was thinking during the 1970s and late 1960s, was all about trying to understand the way in which kind of society disciplines us. Okay, to a certain extent, the book was a rejection of the simple idea that we've become more enlightened with punishment over the course of history. You know, that we used to engage in brutal forms of execution, but that today we have, a relatively humanitarian way of dealing with punishment, which is the prison. What he was trying to suggest was that we haven't become more humane in our punishments, we've become more efficient. We punish better.
We end up with a situation where here in America, we're near the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, but 1 in 100 black men is in jail. And at the same time, specifically to Foucault's point about confession and avowal, we have countless thousands of people serving jail terms because they admitted to crimes they never did.
You know, I think the way it functions, and the way the book is useful in this way to kind of understand a present that was not necessarily Foucault's present, right? It's 1981 in France. The prison issues are somewhat different. But the way that it works is to see that each of these different steps are different kind of ways in which truth-telling is linked to the giving of justice to serve certain relations of power. So to a certain extent, we're left with all of that work to then try to understand in contemporary American society how it is that we produce these notions, both of truth and of justice, in such a way as to allow the forms of massive incarceration that we have today.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.